Thanks to Airbnb, presenting sponsor of African Tech Roundup's podcast miniseries on inclusive travel and tourism, recorded at the Africa Travel Summit. Visit Airbnb.com right now to discover and book unique homes, experiences, and places all over the world. They're all waiting at Airbnb.com. I'm Andile Masugu, and this episode features two South African startup founders working the trenches of the emerging gig economy. First up, the co-founder and CEO of the ride-sharing service LULA. This global fellow of the San Francisco-based Cairo Society is currently spearheading a mission to transform the way people commute by leveraging on the shared economy and mobile technology. Also on the show is the co-founder and CEO of SweepSouth's, an on-demand booking platform for home cleaning services. SweepSouth's is quite notably the first South African startup to be accepted into the 500 Startups Accelerator in Silicon Valley. My guests were both born into families with a rich political history and inherited considerable privilege as a result. The former is the nephew of a former South African Reserve Bank governor, and the latter, the daughter of South Africa's current Minister of Higher Education. Listen in to learn what motivated my guests to forego more cushy professional paths in favor of becoming entrepreneurs, and to find out what it's like to launch and run startups servicing two highly politicized industries. This is an independent African Tech Roundup production. The opinions expressed by me, your host, and those of my guests do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the presenting partner, Airbnb.
Hey everyone, I'm Velani Mboweni, co-founder and CEO of LULA. We are a mobility as a service platform focusing on connecting people to transport to make it accessible, safe and convenient through mobile payments, big data and shared mobility.
Hi, I'm Aisha. I'm co-founder and CEO of SweepSouth's. We're an online platform that connects domestic workers who are vetted and experienced, but who are looking for work because they're under or unemployed, with homeowners who are looking for their services, and we do it through a website and an app that should allow you to complete bookings within a few minutes.
Velani and Aisha, welcome to the African Tech Roundup.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So listen, guys, it's really a privilege to be here with you both, founders in the trenches of Startupville here on the continent. We're going to get to that in a minute. I want us to speed through as quickly as we can your origin stories. So maybe some pivotal points within your past that help explain where you are now and perhaps what led you to your current ventures. And we were speaking offline, Velani, about a conversation you had with your dad at a critical time when you were deciding what to study. You had a passion then for... Wait, tell the people, actually.
I was about 17 years old when my father had asked me, what is it that you think about when you wake up and when you go to bed? And I was like, that's a very broad question to ask. And he said, no, think about it, because once you have the answer to that, it'll probably point you to the direction you want to pursue in life. And when I thought about it at length, I realized that question is, why do people suffer? And I had always wanted to study aeronautical engineering because I was obsessed with aviation and the stars and spacecraft and planes. But I realized that from that point I had to do something that was beyond me. And so I got my first degree at UCT, and which was a Bachelor of Commerce in philosophy, politics and economics, arguably the three most important disciplines around the world. But as I grew in my tech and entrepreneurial journey, I realized that at the heart of people's access to economic opportunity, transport is what underpins us, because you can't access economic opportunity without access to mobility to get you from A to B. And so we're really trying to tackle poverty by virtue of us providing accessible, safe and convenient transport. And 4 years down the line, LULA is a company, mobility as a service platform that's really trying to empower the commuter by empowering the operator first.
Right. And Aisha, I happen to know that you have similarly formative points in your past that have led you to the current journey. Give us a sense of some of those points.
I come from a politically activist family, as we both do. And my parents were always very much about, what is your contribution? Like, you can't just be a person who exists. Like, what are you actually contributing that's meaningful to people? And so I tried to, when I was young, couple that with what I was interested in, which was science. I was a very curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things work, always picking things apart to try and build them again. And with that view, I ended up studying science. I did a Bachelor of Science and then an honors degree and then a master's degree, which I converted into a PhD, focused on gene therapy. And the idea was that I would use what I was learning about science and about the human body in particular to try and fix people who have problems with their bodies, who have genetic diseases. But I started thinking about impact and scope and scale, and had the sense that genetics and gene therapy wasn't the place where you were going to solve South Africa's problems, broad problems, the big issues that affect our country. And so I went into business with the idea that I could have an impact on educating people or employing people and touch more people's lives. And then worked as a management consultant for a little bit, long hours, learned a lot, but also figured out that being an employee wasn't the space for me, and particularly as a consultant, being an employee of an employee wasn't where I wanted to be. So left that and came up with the idea for SweepSouth. And what appealed to me was that it came out of a problem that I'd faced before, that I know a lot of people have faced before, looking for someone to help you at home with domestic work. But looking a little bit into the problem more, I realized how many domestic workers there are in the country. There are over 1 million in South Africa. So 2% of our population are domestic workers, 8% of black women in the country are domestic workers, but many people are still unemployed or underemployed. So how do you use technology to find ways to connect those women to work? And that's where the business spawned out of.
The legacy of sort of the Mboweni family, Tito Mboweni, of course, former Reserve Bank governor, your uncle, Naledi Pandor, a somewhat close relation to you, Aisha. So here's the deal. I have a hunch that perhaps there's a unique confluence of privilege, experience, endowment that you guys have inherited, being who you are and being raised in the families you've been in, that set you up to launch solutions within the sort of shared economy space. If I'm right about that, give me a sense of what those things might be and why. I think the obvious thing that some people listening might be thinking is, well, obviously connected kids with connected families, opens doors. That may or may not be true, but give me a sense of what that looks like and whether my hunch is correct. I see you nodding, Aisha.
When I think about the biggest things that I've gotten from my family, it's education and the importance of education. Like, without being educated, you can't build solutions. And the idea of being someone who's proactive. I think a lot of people forget, right, that like the majority of experience in our childhood was parents who were activists and who had like quote unquote ordinary jobs. My parents were teachers when I grew up, not politicians. They became politicians when I was, a teenager, and my formative years were almost finished by then. So I think the biggest gift that I've had is the one is education and the understanding of the importance of education, access to really good quality education. And the second thing is a stable home environment that has allowed me to focus on what impact I can have on my surroundings, as opposed to how am I going to survive, how am I going to get through the day? And I think those are probably for me the two biggest things.
Both of you tick all the boxes in terms of like higher education and that kind of thing. I sense when you guys say education, I don't think you're pointing to what's hanging on your walls. Something tells me when you guys say education is a bit loaded.
Yeah, so I think education is both in the formal sense, so making sure you study and you complete your degrees, but also learning from what we call the school of life, right? So my late grandfather comes from the abject parts of poverty, right? And he was so poor that he was, 11 years old selling newspapers in Randfontein in nothing but his underwear, but he chose to read every single newspaper that he sold, right? So at the end of the day, he was always very much informed. And beyond that, I think my family also taught me to be resolute in what I do. So whether it's right or wrong, just be resolute that this is a decision you're going to take and make sure it's deliberate. It's 100% or nothing. And from that, I think what we saw in the household, both from my parents and my grandparents, was that these were people who were so committed to other people themselves. It's the kid who needs school fees paid. It's the laptop that needs to be donated to someone going to university. We always saw that life was always beyond you, and you were just an instrument to making the world a better place.
So give me a sense for how you frame market relevance, because you both alluded to it, because there's so many ways to hop on a trend or to harness a technology to, make life better for people. So what's your filter for determining market relevance and what to attack with all the resources that have been endowed in you and basically your great determination, time and effort?
So I think it's being able to understand where there are problems, which I think any South African can do. Like, you hear every day about the problems that our country faces, but then to break those problems down into potential opportunities to fix those problems. And we've both spoken about responsibility and the opportunity to create positive impact. And so with that as the kind of the underpinning of your thinking, then when you think about those problems, you think about, well, then how would I solve that? And then education is the tool that you use to frame that thinking, to have processes to that thinking. So, if I'm going to break down this problem, how do I break it down into how people are affected? How many people are affected? What does it take to actually address it? What does it take to address it at a basic level, and then, build that into a bigger vision? I think that's one part of it. And then the other part is understanding other people and seeking to understand other people. And whatever environment you're in, not letting your reality be kind of the sum total of what you see as the reality of other people in your environment. I have a very mixed background, and as a child I found that incredibly difficult. So, my family was half Muslim, half Christian, half Indian and colored, half black, half this, half that. I grew up in exile and then came to South Africa, and I've never come across someone who has had the same experiences as me, and it's meant that to make friends, I've had to understand my friends' environment, my friends' experiences. And I think that that's helped because I can put myself in other people's shoes. And I think that's what market relevance is about really understanding your customers, but like on an emotional and psychological level, where you really get people and get the things that they're dealing with.
And so I'm thinking the notion, the imaginary of this sharing economy that's becoming a thing, what it can be or should be, a highly politicized issue, for better or for worse. I feel that we're quite lucky that we have founders like you with your background and your ideological bent trying to solve within this trend. But I can totally see why people could look at what you're trying to do and perceive a threat to their livelihoods, to the way things can or should be. Speak to that. In the case of LULA, it's hard to think of a more politicized industry than transport. So give me a sense of how you navigate the politics of winning people over, educating people, and the nuance of how you are approaching solving within this space. And acknowledging that there are big players like Airbnb, Uber, and many, many others who bring various colors to the portrait that's being painted about what this is becoming. And some colors, to my mind, preferable to others. All right, I think it's fair to say. What's your take, Velani?
So I think many people make the mistake of thinking technology exists in isolation. So you can't just have cool technology that exists. You have to have supportive business models, right? And any company that uses tech needs to know that you can't have one business model. You have to have at least two, because if you have one business model, you have no business model, right? And I think for us, one of the challenges that we've had is trying to convince people to have this behavioral change. So what's our riskiest assumption that we're testing with people? And I think that navigating the politics is that traditionally how things have always been done, intelligent transport systems have always cost hundreds of millions of rands. They've always come from overseas, and you always had a huge capital expenditure that you have to incur. Our model was like, look, let's build shared infrastructure, host it on the cloud, and let people plug and play at a fraction of the cost. Then you have operators who say, well, if it's so cheap or if it's so affordable, it must not be real, or it must be fake, or it must probably break or something like that. And we've had those issues, right? But we've been fortunate enough that we're able to partner with some reputable institutions, such as Busmark, which is the largest manufacturer of buses in South Africa, such as the CSIR, which is the largest science and tech resource institute in the whole entire continent, which have helped validate what we're doing. Because not only do they shape policy and trends, they help be the testing ground for these new innovative models and technology. And whilst we may not be there, whilst we may not be where we want to be right now, I think we're a lot further than where we were in the past. And I think it's partnering for your weaknesses, but pushing ahead with your strengths, especially on the innovative business models. I cannot stress that any further. Innovative business models is what really enables the technology to be as disruptive as it's supposed to be.
And Aisha, I feel like probably in the last quarter or so, there's been a huge misunderstanding around perhaps the intent and the value, perhaps even the utility to the people you exist to serve as a company, which is these 2% of our workforce, the domestics. And I have to say, by the way, I have to thank you for our domestic helper who we use on SweepSouth's. She's in such demand. She runs a business. Literally, if there's someone we want to recommend to her, we have to give her a shout, and she'll be like, listen, okay, I'll open up some slots. Tell them I'll be available. She's literally running her own business. And, speak through perhaps, what you're solving for in terms of how marginalized and perhaps vulnerable the constituent you're serving was prior to your platform, and how you are changing that.
So I think like you provide a perfect example, Andilia, of like the ideal experience for someone who's working through our platform. I think it's also important to say though that in 4 years there's no way that we're going to change like the reality for like any sort of meaningful majority of South African domestic workers when you have hundreds of years of entrenched exploitation and abuse, and that takes the form of terrible rates of payment. Just look at the levels of minimum wage amongst domestic workers, and this is government set minimum wage for domestic workers, and it's an absolute pittance, and then the sorts of treatment that people have to deal with on a daily basis from employers, from agencies. There's exploitation, there's sexism, there's racism, and all of this is hugely underpinned by a lack of agency, which speaks to your point, which is that, I hate my employer, they're, racist, or they are mean, or they don't pay me well, but I can't do anything about it because I don't have any other options. And so that's what we're trying to change, is on the one hand through payment, and the rates that people are being paid and setting rates. But we also acknowledge that there's a ceiling there. And I think this is also what we have to do when we think about technology, when we think about new models, we have to be realistic about the context and the reality of the situation that we're in as a country, globally. Like, SweepSouth isn't going to turn domestic work into, a form of work that earns 20, 30, 40,000 Rand a month. That's the reality of it. South Africans can't afford that. There are many domestic workers in the country, I don't think the economy can even afford that. So the reality is, how do you make sure that people are paid at the upper end of what is possible? How do you create a system through technology that enables people to be paid more, that enables customers to pay more if they're able to, that conscientizes customers to the fact that they should be paying more if they're able to? And then, to Velani's point, you want to build an ecosystem around that. You want to have various business models that then contribute to that vision and that feed into that vision. So for us, it's what are the other value adds that you can build onto that? What are people spending money on? Well, what can you use partnerships to either reduce those expenses or get rid of them completely? How do you use partnerships to give people access to education through technology? To access to healthcare and health advice through technology. International models distract us sometimes because of international founders getting up to mischief. And sometimes we get distracted about the actual positive impact that these technologies are creating. So, I don't like what the founder of Uber stood for. I don't like his attitude. But, has Uber been a net positive in terms of, what it's brought to the world? Absolutely. So I think we've got to, not get distracted by founder personalities and founders. I think obviously that's important, and when that becomes culturally pervasive within organizations or within ecosystems, that's a problem. But I think what we need to focus on more is actually how do we all leverage this technology in a positive way, because it's going to happen with or without us. And if we're not part of it as South Africans, then we're going to have the likes of the US and China and whoever else come and take that pie from South Africans. So how do we build those solutions ourselves, and how do we not be so scared of change that we discourage ourselves from being innovative?
I want you to sort of factor in, Velani, on some of the pragmatic considerations you are needing to make as a platform. On some level, you guys are rolling out a platform play with the potential to solve for so many different things. And as founders, you probably have to discipline yourselves to focus on one thing at a time, score wins and build on those wins. Velani, you're solving for transport at the sort of B2C level. What pragmatic considerations are worth putting out there to people listening, potentially looking to invest in the space, be founders in the space?
So I think the pragmatic things you should take into account is firstly openness, right? So in the shared economy, by definition, we have to be open. The second is for us to be collaborative. In the history of South Africa and the history of a lot of countries, everyone thought it was a winner-takes-all model, right? Where,
Like a zero-sum us or them situation.
yeah, so I think even the shared economy is not sustainable if it was zero-sum, right? You see a lot of, people who use Airbnb, they get to, Cape Town or a new city, and they need to know how do they navigate the city, right? So then you have LULA playing its role in terms of shared economy, navigating different transport networks, and Airbnb doing their shared economy stuff. And that kind of collaboration is what needs to make the whole world function a lot better. I think the third thing is also to mention that if you're
I thought you were going to throw Sweep South a bone and go, and then when Andile checks out of his Airbnb, Sweep South sachets in with their domestic help.
I mean, that's a given, right? That's a given. If you're not using SweepSouth, what aren't you?
What's that?
Nice save.
If you aren't using SweepSouth, then you can't sit with us. You know what I'm saying?
I hear you, bro. Sorry, I'm interrupting your line of thought. I'm being chacharach.
Yeah, don't be chatarach, please. Order. I think also the thing is to understand that in this environment that we should not be looking as if the Silicon Valley model, the European model is a cut and paste that can be replicated onto the African environment. Things take a lot more time. We have different experiences, we have different contexts, but we do have what most African people have, and that's resilience, right? You can go any corner of the world, you will always find an African hustling, pushing, doing the entrepreneurial thing. We may not call it entrepreneurship, but it's inherent in us to keep on persevering. And especially if you look at women around the world, African women are the people who continue to persist. The guy wants to get a job, he waits for a few days, doesn't get anything, he goes back. A woman continues and persists, and I think we can learn a lot from women entrepreneurs. So those three things are very critical for us in this environment, and we have to keep pushing that, keep supporting it, and be open, be collaborative, and be persistent or resilient.
What's the line between where you guys are at and what you're trying to build, and what makes sense for you to be here and part of the dialogue that's been happening here?
There's a lot that we can learn, firstly, from the guys who've done it before. And again, whether it's positive or negative, or whether it's the way to do things or the way not to do things. Airbnb is a good example, and I think that example comes from the founders. Like, the founders are, I think they're like all around regarded as good guys who genuine in their intention to have a positive overall impact, versus a founder whose intention is to grow and dominate the world. And actually, at the end of the day, it's not even about the people. Like, it's about the business model, and the people can be done away with.
It's all right, because to the point you made earlier, good or bad, it's probably unhealthy to focus too much on founders in general. But I do think it's worth acknowledging when values set upon founding a business seem to effectively filter through an organization and actually right down to the grassroots.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think in terms of why get involved then with them, why be involved with a summit like this, what can you learn from it? The one is, Airbnb to me is an example of how you create a positive community around an issue. It's also an example of a big company that's based out of Silicon Valley that's come into an emerging market and an economically developing market, and has actually not tried a cookie cutter approach, but it has actually been like, well, this is difficult. We're facing some issues here. We're being confronted with some issues. How do we think differently about how we operate in this market? What makes this different from being in America or being in Europe, and then how do we align ourselves accordingly, which I think is important for us when a lot of our examples are the Silicon. We want to grow to the same size as Silicon Valley giants, but we've got to do it in a different way. And what better example than a Silicon Valley giant who's had to come into our market and think differently about their business. And I think the third thing is just networks. We're so far away from the world's biggest technology hubs, and I think using any opportunity to connect is going to be valuable, and taking advantage of the fact that you've got people here who were involved in the very early days at Airbnb, for example, and who are now in our city and who are making themselves accessible.
I fully agree. I think the Airbnb model actually represents that servant leadership that we really desire the most. The fact that we're having the travel summit here in Langa shows that Airbnb is not trying to create ivory towers, but really trying to show how activity, progress, and empowerment can take place in a decentralized manner. And that's the power of technological platforms like this, right? That, their riskiest assumption in their business model is, would homeowners be able to open up their homes to complete strangers, and it's clearly paid off. But look at the ramifications of that. You're having township development and tourism increasing significantly. We're having so much growth in a place where conventionally would not be looked at. And even as I looked around a number of the companies or stakeholders in the building, it's not just, your high-end hotels and your high-end destinations. It's places that people would not go, but it's places that people, one way or another, would like to experience. And I'm so happy to see that kind of commitment and a true testament to innovative business models and the shared economy doing good. So it's technology for good, and that's what really puts a smile on my face.
We're taking a moment to thank the presenting sponsor for this series, Airbnb. Can you imagine a world without travel? We certainly can't. And that's why at African Tech Roundup, we reckon that the opportunity to travel and experience everything our world has to offer should be something everyone can enjoy. Airbnb happens to think so too. They also believe that Africa's travel and tourism industry can do a lot to sustainably empower and economically elevate underserved communities, which is why they hosted the first ever Africa Travel Summit in Cape Town's Gwalanga Township in 2018, where this series was recorded. Airbnb can't wait to put you onto millions of unique homes, experiences, and places all over the world. Book now at airbnb.com. And now, let's get back to the conversation. Speak to the policymakers who listen to our podcast, listening to us across the continent, in other parts of the world. What are some of your frustrations around the thinking around this shared economy trend, and what would you most like them to know about perhaps how to think about this differently? Do you want them to get out of your way? Do you want them to shut up and stop writing bad concept notes and poor policy and stop spending on expensive conferences and do I don't know what it is, Aisha. I don't want to give them. I want to feed you the answer, but whatever you feel, give us your take.
So how honest can I be, and can I swear? No, I'm kidding.
Straight up and down. You're on the internet.
No, I'm kidding. So I think the worst that policymakers can do is step out of the way and just let innovators do their job. And I mean the worst, as in that should be the worst that you look at doing, as opposed to anything like getting actively involved and stopping people from trying to do what they do would be even worse than that. So the worst they should think about doing is stepping out of the way. I think.
In other words, at very least, leave you guys alone.
At very least, just leave us alone. And I think we're not trying to shy away from regulation. We're not trying to do things that are unethical. I feel like in many cases, society and community will push back really hard against that. And you see that happening all over the world. So, I don't think you need to be policed by policymakers.
You're basically saying the market will correct.
The market will correct. The scale of the market, and particularly in businesses like this that only operate efficiently at scale, will mean that you can't get away with doing bad, basically.
So in cash talk terms, you won't be around long enough to be a worry to them if you don't do right by the people.
I mean, I don't think we won't be around to be a worry to them. I think you won't be around long enough to have any kind of the negative impact that policymakers are trying to defend against is the one thing. But then I think the best thing that they could do is actually sit down. So you hear about all these summits all the time, summits. How many of these summits are involving young people? How many of these summits involve people, particularly around technology, that actually understand or are involved in technology? How many summits like these involve women, and not summits that are based on gender, but actually just broadly like summits?
Sorry to interrupt. I just got this incredible idea. Listen up, all of you shared economy players. Imagine you guys developed a database of people like my wife and I who have bought into this idealized notion of shared economy and its potential. And you made us demonstrate that we've bought in. We'll show you the stats. We'll show you our VIP status on our ride-sharing services. We'll demonstrate how often we use, things like Airbnb, that we use SweepSouth's, and LULA loves us, and so on and so forth. Can you imagine you created a database of those people, and you started to sort of just observe and learn from those people? Imagine a summit of 1,000 people like that. Sorry, I'm just ideating on the spot, but I'm just it's crazy.
No, that would be a big deal. But imagine also a summit of 1,000 people like that, and 1,000 people who provide those services to them. That to me would be incredible. Again, you can't stop what's naturally happening around the world with policy. You you can't also engineer policy for innovation because you don't know what shape innovation is going to take. Like, I think the best that they could do is be open to hearing from young people who may be less experienced but who understand all this stuff a lot better and who live and breathe and eat it. And then to stop thinking so much about the now and about elections and whatever else and kind of the politicking, and think about sustainability. The stuff that we did previously isn't working. So how do you work with people who have new ideas and who can build those new ideas to do things in a different way?
Yeah, I think with all these policymakers, how many of their advisors or advisory boards consist of people under the age of 35? How many of the people are between 19 and 25 or 19 and 35? Because this is the generation that we're supposedly trying to influence and impact, right? And if you don't have people who have those lived experiences and have tried and tested new models, new tech, advising or being part of policy, I think we're playing a very dangerous game. So I think I would probably advocate for policymakers and institutions to kind of set up some sort of, I don't call it millennial board, or some young innovators board that can actually deal with issues like blockchain, machine learning, AI, or digital banking. Because, you know, I think it was Einstein who said this, that you cannot solve a problem with the same mindset you used to create that. And I think the beauty about innovation and disruption is that it actually comes from mindsets that were not part and parcel of an entrenched system. So policymakers, I think, would be doing themselves a great advantage if they incorporated the young minds, incorporated the innovation that we have, and not in a manner that says, oh, you're on the side and, you know, you just tell us, but give them decision-making powers, right? Give them to say, well, this is a bill that we could pass that will make open data available for public transport services, or open data around, you know, how people can better improve the services around, you know, healthcare or housing, etc. And I think those kind of mindsets are much needed, and it's not that they're not there. I think it's just a deliberate exercise that needs to be done and helped. And I think most importantly, if we could have a way to track how policy is performing or at what stage policies are at, some sort of, you know, like when you order you know, a package online, and you can see it's, you know, at the delivery point, it's at the, you know, customs, it's on its way to you. You could have that kind of system for policy, right? Say policy on shared economy, policy on payments, a policy on labor. If you could have that and have people actively contribute, I think we live in a much more prosperous society, right? Because I think we always think the voice of the people is very homogenous, but it's really diverse. And I think that would be a best way to really improve policy and increase participation, but have an overly prosperous society.
You guys are clearly ahead of the curve. Even the Internet Society, you know, its best estimates for internet penetration on the continent, like what are we talking, 22%? Mobile access to the internet taken into account. How much of what you guys are doing is commercially viable, sustainable now versus we need to sort of survive into the future the way some of the big tech brands within shared economy are doing this? Like, let's just get as much money as we can and outlive history, that kind of thing.
I think our models are different because we're dealing with very broad bases within the economy who don't necessarily originally form part of that 22%. And so what it becomes is that there's so many people who you're dealing with that your model can actually drive deeper penetration, higher penetration. So I think there's a natural move, and it's accelerated on the continent. 4 years ago, we had to buy phone contracts for SweepSouth's who joined our platform because no one had smartphones. You know, and I had to sit on the phone with the telcos, kind of begging them to give me a contract for 30 phones or whatever, despite the fact that I couldn't afford it. And now that's not the case anymore because everyone has a smartphone. Everyone who we speak to has a basic smartphone. And so, you know, I think businesses like ours drive that penetration further up as opposed to needing to wait for penetration to catch up. And I think when it's as broadly based as what the industries that we're in, when it's transport, when it's domestic work, it's affecting so many people that then it becomes, oh, there's this thing that I can use to access, you know, information about the best public transport networks. There's this thing that I can use to access work. There's this thing that my husband can use to access work. I better make sure that I get a phone, and I can get it more cheaply now than I could a year or two ago. So yeah, you become part of that move to get people online.
One of the beauties about organizations like ours is our size, and size that we're agile enough to adapt to a number of the challenges that we see. Typical example, if we want to decide whether to add a feature to an app or not, it doesn't take 3 AGMs and a board resolution to do it. It's literally a phone call between 2, 3, 4 members, and you have the app feature there in the next week, right? And I think that's beautiful in the fact that we're always a lot more responsive to demand. And even like whilst we may have the need for smartphones to get the best out of our service, we also have services that can target those who are lower end. In fact, if you guys could see what's in my hand, you'd see that, for example, if you looked at this piece of paper, which is a LULA code, we have people who could not afford the tablets or smartphones that they could put on their vehicles, but we can stick these on people's vehicles. If you don't have data, you don't have a smartphone, you dial our shortcode and it pays for your transport, right? That works on our back end. That is incredibly accessible to most people, right? All you need
So you USSD?
Yeah, basically. All you need to ensure that your battery's on, right? And then you have some sufficient amount of signal to process the payments. So that's the kind of commercial viability we're looking at. And eventually, we could phase this out, but we're still trying to capture as much of the market we can to make mobility accessible. But we know that there'll come a time where everyone is smartphone enabled and data costs will be really affordable and, life will be jolly, right?
So there's this notion of inclusive travel that's been touted at this conference in many different ways. I think people call it so many different things: democratization of tourism and travel, inclusive travel, taking travel to the people, economic empowerment via travel. Like, it's taken so many shapes and forms. It's been really fascinating to see the different ways it's described or perceived by, founders, large incumbents, startups that have turned big themselves. I think of Travel Start, for instance, journalists. Frame that notion for me in a way that makes sense for you, given your context and what you guys are working on. What does that mean, and how does, say, Sweep South feature in that world? If we're not there yet, what should we expect?
There's a customer experience, and that's a really beautiful experience, and I think a lot of people who use technology and who digital natives will get. But then there's also the other part, which is the connecting, right? So it's like, okay, cool, I landed at this place. There are 5 people available for me through whichever platform it is that will give me recommendations about what to eat tonight. Or if I'm going to order, what platform is the best to order from because they're the fastest or have the type of food that I'm looking for or whatever it is. And then the experiences part, again, is, it's the people. So what are the best experiences that I should look for that give me a real sense of what it's like to be in that city from a native point of view as opposed to a tourist point of view. And then I think the other part that's missing is the actual experience of all of those service providers as well. So, I could talk about this for hours and hours, clearly, but, the guy who delivered my food, earlier that day, he delivered a whole lot of packages on the same bike, and he, earlier in that day, gave a couple of people a ride on his scooter when he wasn't busy doing deliveries. And so now he's earned, double or triple what it is that he would have been earning just doing one of them or not doing any of those things. And the woman who's come to clean your home, obviously I have to mention that part, is a mom who's looking after a whole lot of kids and, through her phone and through the same app that she's using to get work, has also halfway through a course that's teaching her how to do basic bookkeeping so she can provide that service to her community. And she also has access to insurance products that she can turn on and off that allow her to care for her family if anything happens on the way to work or at any other point. And so, for me, it's if you focus on the people, that really starts to give you an amazing view of what's possible. Like the people, what their life is like, what their daily lived reality is like, and then how technology can touch every point, in that day, but in a way that doesn't exclude other people or interactions with other people, because I think that's important.
I think for a lot of us, we think of technology as this tool to help us win. And we're not really thinking in terms of service, in terms of how is this helping? Who is this helping? I was actually quite touched to see what you guys were doing just before this interview. You were one of, I think, 5 or 6 entrepreneurs who people had the opportunity to have lunch with. And you guys had really intimate little rooms where people could now hang out with you. And it was like at least 15, 20 minutes past the time people were supposed to break for the next thing. And people were still in there. And I felt so bad for having to sneak in there and go, I need these people, we need to do the podcast. What did people want to learn? What were you helping them with? What themes kind of came up?
So I think from my session, the one critical theme was, ironically, how to get around legislation.
Get around it?
Yeah, get around it. And I simply believe it's sometimes better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, especially in tech.
Careful, because we know that where that took a certain ride-sharing service.
I know, and that's why we're alive and they're not in London. But I think a lot of people are always curious to know about how to get started, right? And because there's so many factors that people consider before starting, and it's almost like they're waiting for a perfect moment to begin. But, as is true to the nature of life, you don't begin with everything in mind. You don't begin with all the perfect conditions. You just do, right? And the first thing is to take the first step, right? And then you'll keep climbing, going, and maybe you'll fail, maybe you'll stop. But you keep on trying, right? Because Airbnb, they face a number of issues that they never considered in the beginning. But the point is, you can't try and do that from the beginning, otherwise you won't get started. And naturally, to all the work that you do, every single step you take will have certain, repercussions. And the point is just to be resilient in that. And I think everyone in my session had some sort of intent to start a business, and maybe some have. They've all faced struggles, but they all know that resilience will keep them, going through. And I was really humbled that I could share my own journey, which, has its ups and downs. It has its own, being uniqueness. But I think it's not unique in the sense that everyone can be an entrepreneur. Everyone can try hard. Everyone can just pursue what they want. And with all the hard work and time, it will pay off. We have lots of struggles. And I think some of the problems with entrepreneurship talks is that we always focus on the good side and not really share the bad side. And I think both Aisha and I have shared a lot of our downsides, and I think that's...
You notice I haven't asked you how much you've raised, also just because typically that's what's covered in what I consider an unhelpful way. I think it's important for us to understand and to celebrate with you guys when you do land investment, for instance. But I prefer to put you guys in the position, which we won't do now, to tell us how things are working, like in true value terms, like the metrics that I happen to care about more than perhaps how much you've been able to attract to your business right now, which heads up to y'all when you come back. All right.
Look, I think our business is in a very interesting stage. We have done a bit of some pivoting, or rather focusing on what we call a shared microtransit service that we're piloting here in Cape Town, which we've been fortunate enough to have about 7 different entities sign up for, with the total ridership of about 20,000 people, with the intent to reduce the number of congestion in Cape Town and increase productivity, given that the city of Cape Town is the most congested city in South Africa, with about 49.1 hours spent in traffic on a yearly basis. So we're really excited to do that. And we've signed up a number of operators. We're looking at ways to make mobility accessible, but we're well on our way to the next big step, as frustrating as it has been for the past 4.5 years.
I do think just generally we need to get more real about, okay, what does 20,000 riders mean for you guys? Like in terms of revenue, what is it costing you to acquire? Bottom line, revenue. If I'm a founder, potentially eyeing the space, an investor, a policymaker thinking about the viability of this, I feel like those are the key things we need to start to talk about more readily than we currently are. But that said, what's your take on the question, Aisha?
So on some of the key themes that came out of our conversations.
Yes, because I literally had to peel you away from some of the people you're chatting with. Like, what was the prevailing sentiment? What do you feel was exchanged? What sort of values filtered to the top?
Interestingly, a lot of it was about the sense that there's this big gap between two sides of a marketplace. And how do you try and bridge that gap in ways that are authentic and in ways where it's not either perceived as or is exploitative. And I shared a little bit about how we use technology to do that, but also how our model went from initially being an Uber for X to actually being about how do you create value on the supplier side, and in doing so then help to empower people to want to then create value to as in your shared, because it's, both our SweepSouth's and our customers. So that was one thing. And then I think also the idea of like technology being really scary to a lot of people and being very new and seeming like this very complicated thing, when in fact technology is a tool like any other tool, and just technology in itself doesn't do anything. But technology with a business model and an idea behind it is something that's useful. So how do you use technology to do that? I have this business. How do I use technology? I think some of it was just people who really want to use technology to enable their businesses, but are quite daunted by the idea of what that'll involve.
Right, and I have to tell you guys, my takeaway is just I'm encouraged that this vision, I don't think it's a unified vision by any means. I think we're working on it, all of us, from Airbnb to you guys to even those of us who are just happy to be served. I'm encouraged that the vision is in good hands, man, and I wish you all the best. I really do. Here's to Sweep South doing its thing. LULA, light up the sky, do the thing. Let's make it work.
Thanks, Andile. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It's been cool sitting with you. Appreciate it.